Hi, I'm Simon Ravens, and if you've seen my previous videos, you'll know I've been trying to explain some oddities of earth music to a visiting Marsh and Martha here. And in the last two videos, I've been dealing with music performance exams and trying to show how and why I think they're fundamentally misconceived. Why, far from animating the thing we call classical music, they're doing quite the opposite. Well, criticising the exams was the easy part. And it would be just as easy to suggest that we follow the example of flourishing musical cultures that don't rely on our kind of exams. That's most of continental Europe and the Americas for a start. In other words, forget exams. Well, that's a nice idea, but in countries that have bought into the exam model, that's just not going to happen overnight. So for now, I think we need to develop a system that encourages animating musicians. The first thing to accept is that for good environmental reasons, online exams are here to stay, and I'm fine with that. But my condition number one would be that every music exam has to be done on a live video call to an examiner with a face and a name. In my experience, examiners are kindly individuals who want positive outcomes. But online, the examiner's still only on a screen, so I'd really like there to be at least one person in the room with the candidate, a real live listener. Why? Because if we want to encourage youngsters towards musical performance, I think they first need to experience performance as something relational, between people breathing the same air. Most professional musicians would tell you that successful studio recordings are really only an extension of their previous live performances. Sure, scheduled exams are less convenient and by implication a bit more costly for an exam board, but come on, this is hardly radical. Until recently, exams were always done at a particular time and place with a particular examiner. And surely the boards are already saving money on hiring a venue, examiner travel, accommodation, and so on. And a scheduled live exam would also help level the playing field. Currently, most instrumentalists and singers have an accompanist there for a limited time, so can do perhaps only one or two takes, whereas pianists, for instance, can record any number of times before they're happy. Any other likely objections? Yes, well, internet connections aren't yet totally reliable, but this hasn't stopped the rest of the working world using video calls, so why should music exams be any different? In any event, the performance could be simultaneously recorded and uploaded as a backup. How about the content of the exams? Well, we could keep the levels as they are at the moment, 1 to 8, and the technical difficulty could remain the same. No changes necessary there, and certainly no lowering of the bar. But now for the differences. At present with the ABRSM, you've two types of exam. Traditional face-to-face with scales, 3 pieces, sight reading and oral. Or performance grade, recording only 4 pieces to camera for upload. I'm proposing a single exam with the following elements. Practical musicianship, quick study, 3 pieces, and an extra element. I'll keep you in suspense about that. Let me put some flesh on the bones. Practical musicianship. This is part theory and part ear training. Personal evidence here. I'm a piano teacher, and almost from the get-go, I teach my own little theory and improvisation course, so quite quickly pupils have an idea of the basic triads and scales in a few major and minor keys. And they can improvise a very simple melody above these chords in duple or triple time. Obviously by grade 8 in my scheme, pupils would have a rather more comprehensive toolbox. And by the way, learning to apply musical theory like this might remove the need for a separate theory exam, although that grisly topic is perhaps for another day. Whatever the grade, say an hour before the exam, the candidate would be digitally sent a written musical idea, including perhaps a harmonic pattern, the intro to a melody and a rhythmic idea, and at the start of the exam would be asked to do what they can with it for a number of bars. Now, this works fine for pianists or guitarists, but how about melodic instruments and singers? Well, a solo improvisation would be possible. Harmony doesn't just mean chords, but solo wouldn't be my preference. Ensemble work will always be the essence of their work, and for their pieces, they already have a pianist present who can presumably accompany this test with a given chord pattern. But non-pianists would also have the option of doing this test at the keyboard. It's your musical brain and ear that's being assessed here, not whether you've got the fingers of Art Tatum. Element 2 is quick study, a short piece received at the same time as the practical musicianship test. So why not just plain sight reading? Answer: because even at professional level, it's far more common to be performing something not at first sight but at second sight. More than that though, even 15 minutes with a short piece will give good musicians a chance to distinguish themselves from those who are only good note processors. And yes, I'd want the given pieces to be music rather than tests written specifically to test reading problems. I mean, who ever had a musical experience hearing or playing a bloodless sight reading test? This is straightforward for pianists, but what about singers, bowers and blowers? Well, one option would be a solo piece, but again, another would be a test that relates to them being ensemble musicians. Well, the accompanist is still there. But the third and main element of the exam would still be playing pieces of music, broadly speaking, one early, one later, and one more modern. Sounds the same as the traditional exam syllabus? Up to a point. The crucial difference in my scheme is that to get the highest marks in your pieces, you'd need to be bold and creative. In a Baroque or classical piece, boldness and creativity might be showing that you can decorate and embellish, particularly in repeated music. In a romantic work, it might be playing from memory, and like 19th century musicians, playing with freedom from the score rather than being shackled by it. In your more modern work, it might well be playing your own composition, which the Trinity board already allow, or improvising in a jazz-style piece. Radical. If you think that all this freedom sounds too much and impossible to examine, well, let's just note that the ABRSM already has jazz exams, in which supposedly improvisation is fundamental. Or perhaps you think what I'm suggesting here isn't too free, but too constrained. Why marry up Mozart's performance practices with how you want to realise his scores today? Shouldn't we be encouraging genuine freedom, Mozart-style improvisations in modern music, or modern styles in Mozart? Ultimately, I'm fine with that, but exams are part of a formative educational process. And even the most creative musicians are formed through past musical styles they've played and heard. Fazil Say learned Mozart as Mozart before he made it Mozart as Fazil Say. All I'm trying to do here is to remind us that for most of musical history, written composition and performance creativity haven't been separated, but happily married. Whatever the composition and approach, technical competence and musical fluency would be the bottom line, but the top line would be boldness and creativity. So you could pass the exam, just as now, playing everything pretty much by the book. But if you want a distinction, you'd have to play with old-style distinction. Fourth and last, the extra element I mentioned earlier. In an ideal world, I'd like there to be a chat between the examiner and the candidate, so the examiner could make some assessment of the candidate's knowledge of and engagement with the music. But there could be a language problem here, so another option would be a video attached separately of the candidate introducing, without notes, and playing a piece to an audience of at least 5 people, say. This element wouldn't even have to be marked, but it would have to be done. To be honest, I'd like this feature for all candidates. More personal evidence here. When I take my pupils to play at street venues or at care homes, that experience of beauty given and pleasure received is fundamental in inspiring kids, hopefully, to become adults who are less likely to fight shy of sharing music. Performance is relational. So come on, what's your response to all of that? Well, I'm aware that a lot of teachers and examiners and some accompanists will be resistant. Pupils? Well, although the current system doesn't exactly encourage it, never underestimate the creative urges of youngsters. But even if you're not scared witless and you like my emphasis on individual creativity, you may have spotted an issue, marking it. Surely a response to individuality must be individual too, so subjective and variable. Well, the ABRSM claims that its marking is objective and consistent, but in my last video I showed why this is at best fanciful. I also showed why objectivity and consistency, even if they were a reality, are anathema to the way we each experience music. But in any event, in one way, I'd say that my system is easier to mark objectively, because in my proposed scheme, if you play by the book competently, you could be marked in the same way as in the current system and you pass. It's when we go beyond pass level that the current marking criteria become more and more subjective. In my system, higher levels would be awarded less on how you do and more on what you do. If you play a piece from memory or you add something to the given notes, that's less a matter of opinion. The act in my book would be of primary importance, and assessing whether the act has taken place is relatively objective. If it has, that for me would basically merit a merit. The examiner's assessment of the act's success would be secondary and more openly and honestly subjective. A distinctly positive impression on the examiner here, and that's right, distinction. But now let me be honest about something else. None of this is going to happen, at least not now. The truth is that the exam system which Sir George Grove put in place 130 odd years ago has shaped a whole classical music culture in those nations which bought into exams. Examined pupils have become exam-preparing teachers and examiners. Witness my own mum. She was a pianist who flew through all the exam hoops, went on to the Royal Academy, and later became a teacher who fully endorsed the ABRSM system. And the pupil she was proudest of was Andrew Dibb, who's gone on to become a chief examiner of the ABRSM. The fact that Andrew and my mum had such mutual respect reminds me that for many inside the exam culture, there'll be much right and nothing much wrong with the musicians it fosters. The changes I'm proposing would entail many of those insiders learning a whole new language, and that might be a scary prospect for those who get by fine in the tongue they first learnt. So if my suggestions became a universal reality tomorrow, I suspect there'd be a sudden exodus of teachers and examiners, although my hunch is that more kids would be wanting to learn the new language. The best I'm hoping for in suggesting all of this, then, is some engagement and either a gradual change of direction from the existing boards or then launching something like my proposal alongside the existing formats. Failing that, some brave soul could always pick up this plan and build their own raft. Good luck. So why do I think this is all so important? Because whereas before the 20th century classical performance was seen as part creative, what exams have produced is a culture of performance as pure recreation. Now, music only becomes a living reality through performance, so if performance doesn't embrace creativity, well, what happens to life forms devoid of creativity? Correct. I can imagine here exam boards pointing to candidates who do really well at grade 8 as evidence that the current system's fine. Well, I'd ask them to take a look down the other end of the telescope. What percentage of kids pick up an instrument and take grade 1, let alone go on to take grade 8? Never mind remaining animating musicians beyond that. Exam boards, please look again at where that line on the graph is pointing, and please look again at your exams.